Thank you. So I should make sure you understand I'm an engineer, and I'll talk to you about who my nutrition science colleagues are. I was going to put this joke slide in, sort of talk about food image analysis as sort of the big data problem you can eat. Probably for the disclosures, this is everybody who's funding research in my laboratory at this time. So I like to disclose everything. It's not just the food image analysis. As far as the acknowledgements, besides my colleagues, as far as the food stuff that I'm going to talk about, it's NIH, it's Curtin University, it's Lilly, it's CTSI, the Purdue Research Foundation, and then some things related to my chair professorship. I should point out I have no financial interest, although the university is trying to commercialize some of the things that we are doing, but I'm staying away from that. I'm an academic. If I start a company, I guarantee it will fail. So, I'd like to acknowledge, of course, Carol Boucher and Deborah Kerr. Carol's the one who sort of drugged me into this problem 10 years ago, and I've been working with her very closely. Also Maggie Zhu, who is another faculty member at Purdue, who's working with this, and then all of our graduate students, and this is not a complete list on what we've been doing. So that's sort of all the disclosures and everything like that. So I'm going to talk about the tada project as sort of a way of describing some of the current work that's going on in this area of food image analysis. And if you want to know more about it, there's lots of information, you go to our website. So tada stands for Technology Assisted Dietary Assessment. And I think I'm the third person, or I guess the fourth person speaking this morning, and I think everybody has agreed with me, and I agree with them, that measuring accurate dietary intake is considered to be an open research problem. You know, it's not solved. We've been working on looking at food image analysis, among other things, for more than 10 years, and we're going to continue to work on it. I think it's a very interesting problem, and I think this whole idea of doing dietary assessment, just like the previous speakers mentioned, is an important problem, and we're not there yet. So, you know, one of the things from the food image analysis point of view, ideally what we'd like to be able to do is take a picture of somebody's meal, be able to sort of extract or segment some of the food items, and then based on those items, be able to identify what they are and the food portion size, and maybe even measure things like before and after images and look at things like plate waste. Now, we have, if you want to know about the tada project, you can go to our website. This is sort of a snapshot of the website. And we also have a companion project in Australia called Chat. This is the work with Deb Kerr. So this is basically the tada system as it currently exists. Although, even though I say that, this picture is still technically wrong, because we also are looking at things like wearables. And we also have another study we're going to be starting in 14 days where we're actually going to be doing continuous blood glucose monitoring to be able to actually use that as metadata associated with the food images. But basically we have a mobile phone app that runs on Android and iPhones. It collects information. You take pictures of your food, but also we collect a lot of metadata. And that metadata, I'll say a little bit more about it, because I think the metadata is going to be very important to look at contextual information, which actually is going to be useful for identifying food and other things. This information is sent back to a cloud-based system where the images are actually analyzed. I should point out to you, eventually, all of this image analysis will be done on the phone, and that will probably happen in the next 3 years, because your phones are getting smarter and smarter with more computational resources. The problem with this, of course, the more computation we do on your phone, the more we're going to burn your battery, so there might be some issues related to that. We have some very sophisticated databases in the background that allow us to take this data and be able to populate it and then share it with researchers and then provide input back. Now, we've been doing this for a long time, and we've looked at a lot of application scenarios, and I'll tell you more about that in a second. But again, the app is relatively easy to use. So we've even had 3-year-old and 4-year-old children use the app. Okay, so it's not very complicated. As a matter of fact, I'm proud to say that my students did not design the user interface. It was Carol Boucher who designed the user interface from the point of view of how somebody would like to be able to use it in the actual field. So Carol, sort of designed it, of course, and we implemented it. Again, this is some of our back-end databases where we're looking at things like the images. We're also looking at other types of data that we're collecting, other metadata, and then we have augmented the FNDDS, which is not complete to be able to look at food composition. Our goal is, again, to be able to take an image and be able to split it up into its components and be able to measure something about that. And here's one of our earlier classification pictures, and of course we got something wrong here, and I'll say more about this as we move forward. Now, we have completed up to this date more than 30 user studies, and this is in free living environments. We've had 2,400 participants use our app. They have collected more than 170,000 food images with metadata. So we have a reasonable amount of data. Probably about 40%, and this number is growing, is this data has now been manually ground truth using our nutrition science colleagues. So in other words, in cases they've looked at the images, been able to hand identify those. We need those so we can measure accuracy and classification. Each food image captures a real eating scene consists of multiple food items. You can go to our website. We've published a lot of papers and doctoral dissertations. We've done one doubly labeled water study. We have another doubly labeled water study we're going to be doing. The publications, the paper for the doubly labeled water study came out a couple of years ago. But, we've had a lot of publications and PhD dissertations. You get copies of all of this. You can go to our website. Again, we've had people down in 3 years old all the way up to people 66. The reason why we couldn't go higher than that is we were limited by the IRB. I don't know why, but they wouldn't let us do anybody older than 70, and so we didn't have anybody older than 70, but we had one person, 75, that wanted to join the study, and we couldn't put them in because the IRB presented it. I think we all have these weird IRB stories, right? Is that true? Everybody? Yeah, okay. Okay. And again, people have used the app in real eating scenarios, and we published a lot of this. We've also done a lot of publications on usability, how people like to use the app, how they don't like to use the app. And again, some of those studies were done in the U.S., some of the studies were done in Australia. So we have published the idea of usability because we are concerned about things like app fade, where people stop wanting to use it. Here's an example of a 9-year-old that used the app. This was a study that was done at on Guam. I think, yeah, this was one of the Guam studies. It says it right there. Okay, so yeah, it's Guam. One of the things that we have done, and this is an active research area, one of the problems is this is being recorded, right? Is that right, Heather? Okay, so I'm not going to say what I was going to say. So should I say this? All right, let me say it this way. How many of you have that gee-whiz Apple phone, the iPhone 10X Big or whatever the heck it's called, the one that costs $1,400? Okay? If you took 2 of those phones and you took color pictures and you analyzed the color pictures, you'd find out the colors are not the same. Okay? So one of the problems is that, and this is true for a lot of mobile devices, and I was going to say something else that I'll tell you privately if you ask me after the talk. So one of the things we're really interested in is 2 things. So it's not one thing, it's 2 things. One is we're interested in the color of the food. The second thing we're interested in is because we want to measure portion size, we've got to be able to measure something accurate. Okay? Now, when you measure something accurate, it's always with respect to what? Okay? Now, the problem is when you're taking a picture of an image, you're taking a picture of a scene, and you want to measure things in the scene, either you have to know how big something is to be able to measure it. Now, this presents problems, particularly if you don't know. We capture the angle. We capture a lot of information off the phone when we take the picture. So what we have done is we've designed this fiducial marker where these colors are very accurate, and they're not even accurate here because of the projection mechanisms. And we also know these relative distance. We ask people to use a fiducial marker in the field of view of the camera. Now, this is not that unusual. Particularly, we want to, like I said, we want to be able to measure something accurately. If you if you go to, for example, NASA's website and look at pictures from Mars, from the 3 things that we have on Mars, or we had on Mars, if you look very carefully, you'll see things like this appear in the images because these are glued onto the vehicle. And so the cameras actually flew over and take these pictures of these things so they can calibrate them, okay? And how do I know this? I have technology on Mars, okay? So some of the image analysis stuff that was on Mars was designed by me, okay? All right, and there's some issues we're trying to do about getting around using this, and I'll say a little bit more about that at the end. Again, we have a very nice user interface in the tada system, and so we can collect a lot of data. It's very simple to use. We could give you the app, most of you in here who have used mobile applications, you probably wouldn't need any instruction at all. Carol, typically when she starts studies, and again, I'm glad to say that of all those participants we mentioned before that have participated in our study, I have never met any of them, okay? Because that's Carol and the rest of the nutrition science people handle that. But when they come in and we start the studies, and there's various mechanisms under which we start a study, you know, Carol gives like 10 minutes on how to use the app, so it's very simple to use. It's very intuitive. And again, we've had people to use it that can't read like young children. We have what we do is we collect a lot of metadata about the food, about the images. We even detect the presence of the fiducial marker. It's a very simple user interface to be able to use. I think I'll skip this part. We also have a review process. In some of our studies we turn it on, some of the studies we turn it off. This is a way we can get feedback from the users about what they actually ate. If we are eating, we can, by turning this on, we can collect textual information if we want about, you know, what people are consuming in their diet. And for some of our studies we turn it on, for some of our studies we turn it off. This review can be used to, among other things besides collecting textual information about what people are eating, they can actually, in some cases, correct what some of the automatic food identification is done. We use this then to generate, for each user, we generate a personal dietary learning model. So we have very sophisticated back-end machine learning tools that essentially learn your diet as you are using the app, and then that helps us increase the accuracy of the food detection. Some of our earlier approaches were based on traditional sort of pattern recognition machine learning approaches, where we did sort of this, looked at features, maybe we looked at color, texture, and some sort of local measurements. We then did some segmentation, and we put this in some sort of a feature extractor and then some sort of a pattern classification system. We're not doing that anymore. Everything we're doing, and this was actually a bigger block diagram of the previous slide, so you can see it was a very sophisticated, early on machine learning approach. And you know, for segmentation, you can see one of the things we did is this was a particular type of segmentation tool, but the idea of this was to be able to segment individual items within the food image. What we are doing now is everything we're doing is machine learning based. In particular, it's deep learning based. And what this requires that we have a lot more food images, and there are ways of doing this. We've driven our accuracies up of identifying foods. So we have a way of doing food localization, food classification, segmentation, and I'll say something about the portion size estimation. So again, one of the things we're doing for the localization means we can find where the food is. We're using something called a faster RCNN. Again, I'm going to skip through some of this machine learning stuff. But the goal here was to use these very sophisticated techniques, and we're using these across the board in a lot of different problems in my lab, but we've had some really, really interesting results as far as driving up our accuracy using machine learning approaches. We are using something called the Inception V3 network for doing food classification. Again, we've got some very good accuracies. Right now, the accuracies we are currently reporting is for one of our larger studies we did. We report out the top 4 foods that we have identified. We get about 95% of the time the correct food is in the top 4. If you only want to look at the top 1, right now we're getting accuracies of about 85%. And that number is going to go up. One of the things that's really important is the use of contextual information. So one type of contextual information you could use things like time, you could use food co-occurrence, you could use date, time, place, dietary habits, work-sleep patterns. And I'll say something about the food co-occurrence, but contextual information is any other information that's not part of the food image, okay? So one of the things we've done with a food co-occurrence is we learn that maybe it's unlikely for you for breakfast to eat cereal and a steak, okay? So we use this co-occurrence technique to be able to use that as side information that we can improve the classification accuracy. Or maybe it's more likely because you're a shift worker that you're eating breakfast at 4 p.m. because you're getting ready to start your day because you work at night. Or it may be because it is a Tuesday and you have Tuesday off work, and it's likely then you're going to be eating differently on Tuesday because you're not working. We've also looked at the idea of, and the first speaker mentioned, who you're eating with. Now, there are some privacy issues. We haven't done as much with that. So this was an example of looking at food co-occurrence. And one of the things that we've done, and we've published several papers on looking at food co-occurrence, but we've come together with a very nice probabilistic model to collect information about food co-occurrence from your diet and then use that food co-occurrence information to help identify foods in the food images, okay? This goes back to us developing a personalized learning model about each person in our study relative to the foods that they consume. And we were able to show that we can drive up the accuracy of our food recognition by as much as 10 percentage points by using contextual information. Now, we've used food co-occurrence. We've also published another paper where we use temporal information. And here again, we had to use a recursive Bayesian model of food consumption frequency that we've developed. In this recursive Bayesian model, we were then able to inject into the deep learning system to be able, again, drive up the food accuracy. And so by looking at the time somebody eats, and this goes back to some of the work I'll say a little bit later on dietary patterns. So again, this was one of our earlier studies. You can see that just what, our basic food accuracy was not that good, but we were able to drive it up using this temporal context information. The other problem we're working on is trying to estimate food portion. Now, the idea of estimating food portions, or in a simple point of view, let's say from the point of view of somebody like me who does a lot of work in computer vision, what we'd like to be able to do is estimate the food volume. The problem with estimating volume of an object from one field of view is the ill-posed inverse problem. Now, the only way you can solve an ill-posed inverse problem is you have to regularize it. Now, you can regularize it by either having some side information or contextual information to be able to do that. And so what we're able to do is we can regularize the problem and solve it by assuming that, by using the food identification. So in other words, if we identify bananas, we can use, let's say, for example, and this is a very simple example, we're way beyond this now, you could use a cylindrical model and say, okay, we know things about the geometry, about how the image was formed. We take this cylindrical model, we project it into this model of how the image was formed. We fit that into the model of the food, and then we measure, we say the volume of the banana is whatever the volume of the model is. That's one way of doing it. And certainly we've done work on this area for a long time. The idea here is that we trying to minimize user burden. We could have people take multiple pictures, and there's ways then of fusing those images to get 3D information. We don't want to do that. We have a study now using that iPhone that I was criticizing that has more than one camera, and we can get stereo images from that iPhone. I saw recently that somebody, I think it was maybe LG, announced a camera that on the backside of the camera they had backside of the phone, in other words, where you usually take pictures, not the selfie ones, there were 6 cameras, okay? I'm not sure exactly why they need 6 cameras, but we'll be able to exploit things like that as we're moving along. And like I said, we do have a new study where we're actually using that new iPhone to be able to look at stereo images. So these are some of these predefined shape models that we've used for some of our foods. And again, this was some of the, this was one of the earlier studies. We were able to predict food volume. Here's some of the error bars. Again, we published this paper. We got really good reviews. In this paper, there's actually another study we didn't do where we compared a study that was done where humans predicted what the food portion size was, and of course we were doing much better than that. We're continuing to do this work. One of the problems that some people don't quite understand, if you want to be able to estimate the food weight and all you have is the volume, you also need the food density. And the FNDDS, which we're using, doesn't have much food density. So one of our colleagues we're actually augmenting the FNDDS by taking, I think we've done maybe 1,000 foods now. We've actually put them into an X-ray CT system and then be able to look at the food density to augment, because the food composition databases don't have enough information. Okay, so this was one of our earlier studies where we actually estimated energy for a particular, this was a controlled feeding study that Carol did. And again, this was one of the papers that you can see that energy to ground truth means we were about 6% over, about 3% under, 1% over as far as estimating the energy. Okay, ongoing work. This is some newer things we're doing, and I should point out to you, there's this community in the image processing computer vision area. Food image analysis is a hot topic now. So you're going to see a lot more groups working on, at one time when we first started working in food image analysis, there was only about 4 or 5 groups in the entire world doing food image analysis. There's a lot more people doing that now. One of the things we've been doing is we're putting together something called the Viper FoodNet data set. It consists of more than 2.5 million food images. Some of them we collected. Other food images we have working with Google to collect these images. These have all been verified using ground sourcing techniques and then further verified by a nutrition scientist looking at that. Our intention is this data set is going to be completely made available to the image analysis community, people that are interested in doing food image analysis. We're also looking at this idea of passive versus active approaches. One of the things that we're working with is Edward Chabanaz at the University of Alabama. In his bite sensor, his ingestive monitoring sensor, he's put a camera on that. We're now acquiring those images. We're taking the images from his bite sensor, and these are not cell phone images. We have a very preliminary study done where we were able to identify the food 85% of the time. That was just food identification. We're still doing the work on looking at portion size estimation. This is stuff we're doing more on the food image analysis side. If you're a machine learning person, we're doing things like we're looking at semantic segmentation and transfer learning to be able to minimize the amount of training data we need to be able to do some of the food image analysis. We are looking still at this depth prediction to be able to do the volume estimation from a single image using something called one-shot learning. And we're looking at a bunch of unsupervised approaches for being able to handle a large number of foods. Another thing that's really driving some of their work is this area called generative adversarial networks, or GANs. This is another part of the deep learning community. A lot of people are using these techniques to be able to generate synthetic ground truth images or images that have been labeled, so you can use these for training some of the food analysis. So what this means is that it is possible in an actual study when somebody is taking pictures of their food, we could identify a food that we've never seen before by using one of these GAN systems. And this is an active thing going in my work. We also have a new NIH project that just started last August where we're looking at extracting of dietary patterns using exercise information and also the food images. And so again, we're applying relatively new machine learning techniques to be able to sort of fuse this type of information. So we want to combine the activities with the food images and sort of investigating new types of dietary patterns. I guess takeaways, I would say, modern machine learning methods will change how we do dietary assessment. I think modern machine learning techniques, particularly some of these deep learning methods, and things related to that, like the use of GANs, are going to drive up the accuracy in doing food image analysis. And there still is this issue about active and passive approaches. I have problems with people that argue passive approaches, wearables, the only way to go. I think wearables have other issues. You know, how many times have you, this in a sense is maybe your ultimate wearable. How many times have you forgot to charge this or turn it on? And I think, we're not there with, infinite long battery life. I also think, again, one of the things that really fascinates me that was mentioned this morning, and I was so glad to hear that, is this idea of looking at sort of internal measures. And like I said, we have this study where we're going to be doing 24-hour glucose, active glucose monitoring of our participants. And so we're going to try to tie that to looking at food consumption. Okay, there's, again, my acknowledgements. And this is all the people that do the work. I get to go to Florida, and they stay back in West Lafayette. These are all my PhD students. Okay, not everyone's working on food, but about 5 of them in there are working on food image analysis. Thank you.